War is usually remembered for bravery, sacrifice, and heroic last stands. But history has another category that rarely makes it into textbooks. The category where logic packed its bags, left the battlefield, and never came back. Because not every death in war is the result of enemy fire. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is confidence mixed with a catastrophic misunderstanding of how reality works. The 10 stories in this video are not tales of unlucky soldiers. They are case studies in decisions so spectacularly misguided that they feel less like military history and more like physics teaching humanity a very harsh lesson. Explosives were misunderstood. Weapons were used creatively in ways absolutely no engineer ever intended. And in several cases, the enemy didn't even need to show up. Think of war like a giant test of survival instinct. Training exists to sharpen that instinct. Experience exists to reinforce it. But every now and then, someone manages to take that survival instinct, put it in a box, throw the box into the ocean, and then proceed with the plan anyway. And the result is what historians politely call a preventable incident. What you're about to hear are 10 moments where soldiers ignored the one voice in their head that should have been screaming, "Maybe this is a bad idea." Starting with a medieval king who proved that armor can protect you from arrows, but it turns out it does absolutely nothing against gravity. 1. The king who charged a cliff. In the year 1066, Europe was in the middle of one of the most chaotic power struggles in medieval history. England had just lost a king. Every ambitious nobleman in Northern Europe suddenly decided that the empty throne looked like a wonderful career opportunity. One of those men was King Harald Hardrada of Norway, a legendary Viking warrior whose resume included decades of battle across Europe. Hardrada was not inexperienced. He had commanded armies, crushed rebellions, and survived more combat than most medieval soldiers could imagine. Which makes what happened next even more impressive in the worst possible way. During the invasion of England, Hardrada's army clashed with English forces near Stamford Bridge. At one point in the battle, a group of Norse warriors began pushing English troops toward a narrow rocky ridge overlooking a steep drop. Hardrada, wearing full chainmail armor, a helmet, shield, sword, and the confidence of someone who had never lost a major battle, decided to personally lead the charge. From his perspective, the situation looked simple. Enemy in front, victory ahead. Charge forward. What Hardrada failed to notice in the chaos of the battlefield was a small geographical detail. The ridge he was charging along was not flat ground. It was the edge of a sheer drop nearly 40 feet down into a rocky ravine. Now, under normal circumstances, gravity is a fairly predictable force. But gravity becomes dramatically more persuasive when you are wearing over 60 pounds of medieval armor and sprinting forward at full speed. Hardrada rushed forward with his men. He swung his sword. He stepped forward again. And then he stepped where ground used to be. There was a brief moment where several soldiers reportedly watched their king vanish from view, followed by the unmistakable sound of several hundred pounds of armored Viking hitting solid rock at terminal embarrassment velocity. Medieval chroniclers later wrote about Hardrada's bravery, his leadership, and the ferocity of his charge. What they politely left out was that the most effective defensive weapon used by the English that day was a cliff. Hardrada didn't fall to an enemy blade. He lost a fight with basic terrain awareness, a brutal reminder that even the greatest warriors in history are still subject to the same universal law that governs everything else on Earth. If you run fast enough toward the edge of a cliff, gravity will happily finish the battle for you. 2. The soldier who looked down a cannon. Cannons are not complicated machines. For centuries, the basic concept has remained beautifully simple. You put explosive powder in one end, a heavy metal projectile on top of it, and then you make absolutely sure that nobody is standing in front of the other end when it goes off. Most military manuals, regardless of century or country, have always agreed on this one extremely important safety guideline. Never look into the barrel of a loaded cannon. It sounds obvious. So obvious, in fact, that you would assume no professional soldier would ever need to be told. History, however, has repeatedly proven that assumptions are dangerous things. During the 18th century, artillery units were the technological superstars of the battlefield. Cannons could shatter enemy formations, tear through fortress walls, and completely reshape the outcome of a battle in seconds. But like any powerful machine, they required discipline and strict procedures. One artillery crew learned this lesson in a way that was both immediate and unforgettable. The crew had been preparing their cannon for the next volley. Powder had been packed carefully into the chamber, followed by the cannonball itself. Everything was ready, except for one minor issue. When the moment came to fire, the cannon did absolutely nothing. No bang, no recoil, just silence. Now in the chaos of battle, a misfire is not just inconvenient, it's dangerous. Every second that cannon sits silent is a second the enemy has to advance. So the artillery crew did what soldiers have done for generations when machinery refuses to cooperate. They began troubleshooting. Maybe the powder didn't ignite. Maybe the fuse was faulty. Maybe the cannonball had rolled too far down the barrel. Several soldiers gathered around the cannon discussing the situation. One of them, convinced that the problem must be a simple obstruction, decided the best way to diagnose the issue would be to look directly down the barrel of the cannon. Now, to be fair, from his perspective, this probably seemed like a logical step. If something is blocking the barrel, you look inside. That works perfectly well with pipes, tubes, and garden hoses. Cannons, unfortunately, are slightly less forgiving. As the soldier leaned forward and placed his eye near the muzzle of the cannon, another member of the artillery crew decided to test the firing mechanism again. What they didn't know was that the original ignition had actually worked. The fuse had simply been burning slowly inside the cannon. So, at the exact moment the curious soldier decided to investigate the interior of the barrel, the cannon finally decided to do its job. The explosion that followed was exactly what artillery engineers had designed the weapon to produce. A massive burst of explosive force launched the cannonball forward with terrifying speed. Unfortunately, the soldier inspecting the barrel had accidentally placed himself directly in the path of that launch sequence. In the history of artillery safety training, this moment became an extremely persuasive argument for maintaining proper distance from loaded weapons. Because cannons are very patient machines. They may take a moment to fire, but when they finally do, they are absolutely committed to finishing the job. The artillery crew that day learned a lesson that military engineers had understood for centuries. There are many effective ways to inspect a cannon. Looking down the barrel is not one of them. 3. The grenade that came back. Grenades are one of the simplest weapons ever invented. The design philosophy behind them is almost elegant in its simplicity. Pull the pin, throw the grenade. Get as far away from it as possible before it explodes. 3 steps. Even soldiers who have never used one before usually understand the basic idea within seconds. Which is why what happened during one military training exercise became a perfect example of how even the most foolproof systems can fail when human confidence enters the equation. The setting was a routine training drill, nothing dramatic, just a group of young recruits learning how to properly handle live grenades under the supervision of experienced instructors. Live grenade training is one of the most serious exercises a soldier can go through, because unlike most training equipment, grenades are not pretending to be dangerous. They are dangerous. Every recruit is carefully briefed on the procedure. Stand behind cover. Pull the pin. Throw the grenade over the barrier into the safe pit. Then immediately duck back down. Simple. But one recruit that day was feeling particularly confident. He had watched several others throw grenades successfully. He had studied the instructions. He understood the steps. What he did not fully appreciate was that adrenaline has a remarkable ability to temporarily disconnect the brain from basic coordination. When his turn arrived, he stepped forward holding the grenade exactly as instructed. The instructor watched closely from a few feet away. Pull the pin. The recruit pulled the pin. Throw the grenade. The recruit wound up his arm. And then something very strange happened. Instead of releasing the grenade forward toward the target pit, he held onto it. For just 1 extra second. It was the kind of tiny mistake that normally wouldn't matter in everyday life. But grenades operate on a schedule that is extremely unforgiving. Inside the metal casing, the fuse had already been burning. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. By the time the recruit realized he was still holding the grenade, panic replaced confidence. And panic rarely improves decision-making. Instead of throwing it into the pit like he was supposed to, he reflexively tossed it sideways. Unfortunately, the sideways direction happened to be the exact location where several other recruits were standing behind the safety barrier. The grenade bounced off the concrete wall like a small metal tennis ball, then rolled gently across the ground, back toward the man who had thrown it. Now at this point, several soldiers were shouting. Some were diving for cover. The instructor reportedly had just enough time to realize that this training exercise had officially left the realm of educational experience. The grenade detonated exactly where grenades are designed to detonate, loudly, violently, and completely indifferent to the fact that its owner had completely misunderstood the throwing instructions. Military instructors often spend hours explaining proper grenade technique, grip, angle, release timing. But the most important lesson from that day didn't require a training manual. Because when it comes to explosives, there is one rule that should always be remembered. If you throw a grenade, you should probably make sure it actually leaves your hand. 4. The bomb that was used as a hammer. Military equipment usually comes with very clear intended purposes. Rifles are for shooting, radios are for communication, helmets are for protecting your head. And bombs, for reasons that should be painfully obvious, are designed to explode. They are not tools, they are not construction equipment, and they are definitely not supposed to be used as improvised hardware. But throughout history, there has always been one universal constant inside every army. Sooner or later, someone will look at a dangerous object and think, this will probably work fine. During World War II, one unfortunate soldier managed to demonstrate exactly why that assumption is rarely correct. The situation itself was completely routine. His unit had been clearing equipment in a temporary camp after a recent operation. Ammunition and unexploded ordnance had been collected and placed in a designated storage area, while engineers prepared to safely dispose of them. Among the collection were several artillery shells and small aerial bombs. These objects were not toys. They were essentially containers filled with explosive compounds powerful enough to level buildings. But to the untrained eye, they looked surprisingly ordinary. Heavy metal cylinders, solid, durable, conveniently shaped, which is exactly what caught the attention of one soldier who was struggling with a very minor problem. He was trying to drive a metal stake into the ground. Normally this task requires a hammer, but on this particular afternoon, the soldier did not have one. Instead, he had something else. A bomb. Now, from a purely visual standpoint, the object looked strong enough to handle the job. It was made of thick metal. It had weight, and in the moment, it probably seemed like a clever solution. Rather than walk across the camp to find the correct tool, the soldier simply picked up the unexploded bomb and used it to strike the metal stake. The first strike went fine. Metal hit metal. The stake moved slightly into the ground. Encouraged by this success, the soldier lifted the bomb again and swung harder. The second strike, unfortunately, produced a very different result. Inside the bomb was a fuse system designed to react to sudden impact. Normally, this impact would come from hitting the ground after being dropped from an aircraft at several hundred miles per hour, but apparently the internal mechanism was perfectly happy to respond to a strong hit from an improvised hammer as well. What happened next was less of a mechanical malfunction and more of a design feature finally doing exactly what it was built to do. The bomb detonated instantly. The explosion was powerful enough to be heard across the entire camp. Soldiers nearby reportedly thought the unit had come under sudden attack. It took several minutes before the horrifying reality became clear. No enemy artillery had struck the camp. No air raid had occurred. The explosion had been triggered by a man attempting to solve a very simple construction problem with a very complicated piece of military hardware. Military engineers spend years designing explosives to be stable, reliable, and safe to transport. But there is one scenario that no engineering team can fully design around: a soldier who decides that a bomb looks like a convenient hammer. Because while war is full of dangerous weapons, sometimes the most unpredictable element on the battlefield is the person holding them. 5. The tank that ran over its own commander. Tanks are among the most intimidating machines ever built for war. They are massive armored vehicles designed to crush obstacles, absorb enemy fire, and dominate the battlefield through sheer mechanical force. A modern tank can weigh anywhere from 40 to 70 tons depending on the model. That is roughly the same weight as a small house moving across the ground on metal tracks. Which means there is one extremely important rule when operating around a tank. Never stand where the tank might drive. This rule is repeated constantly during military training. Tank crews are taught to maintain strict communication and clear positioning whenever the vehicle is moving. Because tanks are powerful, but they are also loud, heavy, and surprisingly difficult for the driver to see around. During one training exercise many years ago, a tank unit learned exactly why those safety rules exist. The crew had been conducting routine maneuvers in an open training field. Nothing unusual, just a standard practice session designed to improve coordination between the driver, gunner, and commander. The tank commander stood partially outside the turret hatch, observing the terrain and giving instructions to the driver through the internal communication system. This is normal procedure. From the commander's position, he can see the battlefield more clearly than the driver, who has extremely limited visibility through small viewing ports. At one point during the exercise, the commander decided to step down from the vehicle briefly to inspect something on the ground. Perhaps it was an obstacle. Perhaps it was a positioning marker used during the training drill. Whatever the reason, he climbed down from the tank and moved near the front of the vehicle. Now, under normal circumstances, this is where communication becomes extremely important. The driver must know exactly where the commander is standing before the tank moves again. But battlefield training environments are noisy. Tank engines roar like industrial factories. Tracks grind loudly against dirt and rock. Communication systems sometimes crackle with static. And sometimes, unfortunately, people assume things have been clearly communicated when they have not. The driver inside the tank believed he had received the command to move forward. From his perspective, everything was routine. He slowly engaged the controls. The massive machine began rolling ahead. What the driver could not see from inside the armored hull was the exact position of the commander standing just a few feet in front of the vehicle. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. A tank does not stop quickly. When 50 tons of steel begins moving forward, it requires time, distance, and very strong brakes to bring it back to a halt. Unfortunately, the human body is not designed to withstand even a small fraction of that kind of force. The vehicle rolled forward exactly as designed, relentlessly, powerfully, completely unaware that the person who had been giving orders moments earlier was now directly in its path. The rest of the crew reportedly reacted immediately, shouting warnings and attempting to stop the vehicle. But physics is rarely impressed by last-second panic. By the time the tank finally stopped, the commander had become the single worst obstacle the vehicle had encountered all day. Tank crews spend years learning how to defeat enemy armor. But that day, the most dangerous threat on the battlefield was not an opposing army. It was a breakdown in communication between a 50-ton machine and the person who had been standing in front of it. A brutal reminder that tanks are excellent at crushing obstacles. Unfortunately, they do not always ask what those obstacles used to be. 6. The soldier who tried to cook lunch on a landmine. Landmines are one of the most terrifying inventions ever created in modern warfare. Unlike most weapons, landmines are designed to do absolutely nothing. They sit quietly underground, sometimes for years, patiently waiting for one specific event: pressure. The moment enough weight presses down on the trigger mechanism, the mine activates instantly, releasing a blast powerful enough to destroy vehicles or severely injure anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby. Because of this, soldiers are trained from the very beginning to treat mines with extreme caution. Entire military manuals exist dedicated to one simple instruction: stay away from them. But during one long, exhausting military operation in a remote region, a group of soldiers encountered a situation that seemed harmless enough. They had been traveling for hours, it was hot, supplies were limited, and most importantly, they were hungry. Now, field rations are not exactly famous for their culinary excellence. They are designed to be efficient, portable, and long-lasting. Flavor is not usually the priority. So when the soldiers came across what appeared to be a small metal disc partially buried in the dirt, one of them had an idea. To the trained eye, the object was clearly recognizable as a landmine. But to someone who had been marching all day under the sun, it looked like something else entirely. A solid piece of metal, flat, stable, and sitting directly on the ground. In other words, the perfect place to build a small cooking fire. Now, to be fair, the soldier probably understood that landmines are dangerous, but he also assumed something very important, that the mine had already been inactive for years. After all, it wasn't exploding right now, and it had probably been sitting there for a long time, which in the minds of many people automatically translates to safe enough. So with the confidence of someone about to prepare the world's most questionable campfire meal, the soldier placed a small pot directly on top of the metal disc. Then he gathered some dry sticks, lit a small fire beneath the pot, and waited for the water to heat. For a few minutes, everything seemed perfectly fine. The pot warmed, the fire crackled, the soldiers relaxed. What none of them considered was the fact that landmines are not particularly sensitive to time, but they are extremely sensitive to pressure and heat. As the flames burned beneath the pot, the metal casing of the mine slowly warmed. The internal components began to expand slightly. Springs tightened. Chemical elements inside the fuse became unstable, and eventually, the mine's trigger system decided that it had experienced more than enough disturbance. What happened next was exactly what landmines are designed to do. There was no warning, no countdown, just a sudden, violent explosion that instantly transformed the peaceful lunch break into a blast zone. The mine detonated with devastating force, scattering dirt, metal fragments, and pieces of cooking equipment across the surrounding area. The soldiers who had been sitting nearby had just enough time to realize that their improvised kitchen had been built on top of one of the most dangerous objects on the battlefield. Military engineers spend enormous amounts of time designing mines to remain hidden, stable, and lethal for years. But even the best engineers in the world cannot design a weapon that anticipates every possible misuse, especially when someone decides that a landmine looks like a convenient stove burner. Because while hunger may inspire creativity, creativity is not always the best strategy when sitting on top of an explosive device. 7. The soldier who tried to throw back an artillery shell. War has a strange way of teaching people extremely practical lessons about physics. For example, bullets travel faster than you can run. Explosions happen very quickly. And artillery shells are not objects that should be handled casually. But during one chaotic moment on a battlefield many decades ago, a soldier attempted something that would have been impressive, if it had been physically possible. The setting was a defensive position where several soldiers were taking cover from incoming artillery fire. Artillery shells are terrifying weapons. They travel long distances, fall from the sky at high speed, and explode with enough force to shred everything nearby. But sometimes artillery shells fail to detonate immediately. This creates what soldiers call unexploded ordnance, or UXO. And UXO can create a dangerous illusion, because when a shell lands and doesn't explode right away, it can briefly look harmless. Just a heavy metal object sitting quietly in the dirt. During one bombardment, exactly that happened. A shell crashed into the ground near a group of soldiers, but instead of exploding instantly, it buried itself slightly into the soft soil and sat there, silent, still. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Now, most soldiers in that situation follow a very simple rule. Get away from the unexploded shell as quickly as possible. But one man had a very different idea. Perhaps it was adrenaline, perhaps it was panic, or perhaps he had simply watched too many war movies. Because in action films, there is a very common scene where a hero picks up a live explosive device and throws it back toward the enemy just before it detonates. It looks dramatic, it looks heroic, and in movies, it works every single time. Unfortunately, real artillery shells are not designed with Hollywood timing. The soldier saw the unexploded shell sitting in the dirt, and instead of running away, he ran toward it. His apparent plan was simple: pick up the shell, throw it back toward the enemy position, save the day. Now, there were two very serious problems with this plan. The first problem was that artillery shells are extremely heavy. Depending on the type, they can weigh anywhere from 20 to over 90 pounds. The second problem was that the shell had not actually failed to detonate. The fuse inside it was simply delayed. So by the time the soldier reached the shell and bent down to grab it, the internal mechanism had almost finished its countdown. Witnesses later described seeing the man reach for the metal casing. He grabbed it with both hands, and for one brief moment, It probably looked like he was about to perform the most heroic throw of the entire battle. Then the artillery shell finally decided to complete the job it had been fired to do. The explosion occurred exactly where the soldier was standing. Artillery shells are designed to destroy fortifications and scatter lethal fragments in every direction. And unfortunately, they are extremely effective at accomplishing that mission. The soldiers nearby later remembered the moment as a grim reminder of something that military training tries very hard to emphasize. Movies are not instructional videos. Explosive devices do not wait politely while someone decides what to do with them. And artillery shells are not something you can casually pick up like a baseball. Because when a 90-pound explosive device lands next to you on the battlefield, the correct response is not to throw it back. The correct response is to run away, very, very fast. 8. The grenade that needed testing. Military explosives come with one very clear rule. If you are not absolutely certain whether an explosive device is safe, you should assume it is not. Because grenades, mines, and artillery shells do not come with convenient labels that say, "Don't worry, this one is harmless." But during one quiet moment at a forward military outpost, a soldier encountered an object that triggered one of the most dangerous impulses known to human curiosity: the impulse to check for yourself. The object in question was a hand grenade that had been discovered lying in the dirt near the perimeter of the camp. No one was quite sure where it had come from. Maybe it had been dropped during an earlier skirmish. Maybe it had fallen out of someone's gear during a patrol. Either way, it was sitting there, quietly, unmoved, unexploded. And that quietness created a very misleading impression. To several soldiers nearby, the grenade looked old, inactive, possibly even defective, which naturally led to the most important question that should never be asked about an explosive device. Do you think it still works? Now in professional explosive disposal units, this question is answered using robots, specialized equipment, and highly trained technicians. But this particular soldier had a far more direct approach in mind. Instead of calling the engineers or carefully securing the area, he decided to conduct what might generously be described as a field test. His logic was simple. If the grenade was still active, then triggering it in a controlled way would prove it. And if it wasn't active, then there was nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, his definition of controlled involved getting extremely close to the grenade. Very close. Close enough to examine the metal casing and fuse assembly. The soldier reportedly picked it up and inspected it for a moment. Still nothing happened, which only increased his confidence. To him, the grenade now seemed even more harmless. Just a small piece of military hardware that had probably been lying there for months. So, he decided to perform one final test. He struck the grenade lightly against a nearby rock. The idea, apparently, was to see if any internal components would react. Now, in theory, this was not a completely unreasonable experiment, except for one very important detail. Grenades are designed to react to sudden impacts. That is, quite literally, how many of their fuse mechanisms are engineered. They are built so that when thrown and struck against a surface, the internal striker ignites the explosive charge after a short delay. So, when the soldier tapped the grenade against the rock, he unknowingly performed the exact action that the grenade had been waiting for since the day it was manufactured. The internal mechanism activated instantly. There was a small click, and in that moment, several nearby soldiers reportedly realized what had just happened, because everyone on a battlefield eventually learns the sound a grenade fuse makes. Unfortunately, the soldier conducting the test had already run out of time to analyze the results of his experiment. The grenade completed its design function with brutal efficiency. And the conclusion of the field test was extremely clear. Yes, the grenade still worked. Explosive engineers often spend years designing weapons to function reliably under harsh battlefield conditions. But even the most carefully designed explosive cannot account for one unpredictable variable: human curiosity. Because when someone asks whether a grenade is still active, there is usually a very simple way to find out. Just not one that involves holding it in your hand. 9. The rocket launcher that was fired indoors. Rocket launchers are among the most powerful handheld weapons ever issued to soldiers. They are designed for one specific purpose: destroying armored vehicles, fortified bunkers, and anything unfortunate enough to be standing directly in front of them. To accomplish this, rocket launchers generate an enormous amount of explosive force. But there is one critical detail that often gets overlooked by people who have never fired one before. Rocket launchers do not just produce danger in front of the weapon, they also produce something equally destructive behind it. This phenomenon is called backblast. When a rocket launcher fires, high-pressure gases explode out of the rear of the launcher to balance the force pushing the rocket forward. This rear blast is extremely hot, extremely fast, and extremely dangerous. Which is why every military training manual repeats one simple instruction: never fire a rocket launcher inside an enclosed space. Unfortunately, instructions only work if someone decides to follow them. During one operation in an urban combat zone, a group of soldiers had taken shelter inside a damaged building while preparing an ambush position. The room they occupied was small: concrete walls, broken windows, dust and debris scattered across the floor. From the outside, the position offered a clear line of sight down a narrow street where enemy vehicles might appear. One soldier had been assigned the rocket launcher. From his position near a window, he could easily aim the weapon down the street. Everything seemed perfect, except for one critical oversight. He was standing inside the room. Now, experienced rocket operators know that firing from inside a building requires careful positioning. You must have a large open space behind you. Doors or walls must be clear. Otherwise, the backblast will reflect violently inside the structure. But the soldier holding the launcher either forgot this rule or underestimated just how powerful the backblast would be. When the moment arrived, he aimed the launcher out the window, locked onto the target area, and fired. The rocket itself performed beautifully. It streaked forward out the window exactly as designed. But at the exact same moment, a massive jet of superheated gas erupted from the back of the launcher. Normally, this blast would disperse harmlessly into open air. But inside the small concrete room, the gas had nowhere to go. Instead, it slammed into the wall behind the soldier and violently ricocheted back into the room. The blast wave filled the entire space instantly. Temperatures soared. Pressure surged. Loose debris flew across the room like shrapnel. The confined space essentially transformed the weapon into a self-inflicted explosion. Several soldiers in the room were thrown to the ground by the force of the backblast, and the unfortunate operator who had fired the launcher absorbed the worst of the shockwave. The rocket successfully left the building and continued downrange, but the room behind it had already become the most dangerous place in the entire battlefield. Rocket launchers are remarkable pieces of military engineering. They can destroy tanks. They can collapse fortified walls. But they also come with a very clear operational requirement. You must remember that the weapon fires in two directions, one direction toward the enemy, and the other directly into whatever happens to be standing behind you. Which is why military instructors emphasize a rule that cannot be repeated often enough. When firing a rocket launcher, you should always make sure the enemy is in front of you, and not accidentally behind you in the same room. 10. The soldier who looked into a rocket tube. By the late 20th century, military technology had become incredibly advanced. Guided missiles, night vision systems, smart targeting computers. But despite all this sophistication, one fundamental truth about weapons has remained unchanged for centuries. If something is designed to launch explosives, you should probably avoid putting your face directly in front of it. Unfortunately, during one training exercise, a soldier managed to ignore this very basic principle. The unit had been conducting a routine drill involving a portable anti-tank rocket system. These launchers are powerful weapons capable of destroying armored vehicles. But like all military equipment, they occasionally malfunction. And when a weapon malfunctions, soldiers are trained to follow a very strict procedure. Step 1. Stop using it. Step 2. Call a qualified technician. Step 3. Stay a safe distance away. But in this case, curiosity arrived before caution. During the exercise, one of the rockets failed to fire when the trigger was pulled. No launch, no smoke, nothing. From the outside, the launcher looked completely inactive, which created the same dangerous illusion that has caused problems for soldiers for generations. If a weapon doesn't immediately work, maybe it just needs to be checked. The soldier holding the launcher began inspecting the tube. Maybe the rocket hadn't seated correctly. Maybe something inside was blocking the launch system. To find the problem, he decided to do something that seemed logical in the moment. He turned the launcher slightly and looked directly into the front of the tube. Now, under normal circumstances, this would not be a particularly good idea. But in this case, it was especially unfortunate. Because the rocket inside the launcher had not failed to fire, it had simply experienced a delayed ignition. Inside the tube, the propellant system was still active. The moment the internal ignition sequence finally completed, the rocket motor did exactly what it was designed to do. It ignited instantly. Rocket motors generate enormous thrust in a fraction of a second. Normally, this thrust sends the rocket flying safely downrange. But on this particular occasion, the soldier had positioned himself exactly where the rocket was supposed to go. The launch occurred with explosive force. The rocket blasted forward out of the tube, leaving behind a trail of smoke and a group of stunned soldiers who had just witnessed a safety rule being broken in the most dramatic way possible. Military weapons are engineered with incredible precision. They perform their tasks with mechanical reliability, but they cannot account for one unpredictable factor: human curiosity. Because sometimes the most dangerous place to stand is not in front of the enemy, sometimes it is directly in front of the weapon you are holding. War is full of stories about courage, stories about impossible odds, stories about soldiers who made brilliant decisions under pressure. But every now and then, history also records moments that feel less like heroism and more like reality, reminding people that physics always wins. The 10 stories in this video are not just strange accidents. They are examples of what happens when confidence replaces caution. Explosives were treated like tools. Weapons were inspected in ways their designers definitely never intended. And in several cases, the battlefield didn't even need an enemy to become dangerous. Because the truth is, most safety rules exist for a reason. Someone, somewhere, ignored that rule once before. And the result was memorable enough that the military decided to write it down permanently. So here's the real question. Every single person watching this video has had a moment where a small voice in their head said, "Maybe this is a bad idea." But you did it anyway. Maybe you got lucky. Maybe nothing happened. Or maybe you came dangerously close to earning your own Darwin Award. What was the situation? Tell the story in the comments, because sometimes the best lessons about survival come from the moments where